Even with full American backing, can Israel's enormous military power prevail over militant Arabs? And most chilling of all, could the festering differences precipitate a military confrontation involving the use of nuclear weapons? It is known that Israel has a major nuclear arsenal and the capability to launch weapons quickly. Although some extremists disagree, most Israelis have learned that they cannot reconstruct the Kingdom of David, which includes all of the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and parts of Lebanon and Jordan. At the same time, most Palestinians have been forced to accept the fact that the nation of Israel will never be erased from the map. Palestinian human rights must be protected, as generally recognized under international law, including self-determination, free speech, equal treatment of all persons, freedom from prolonged military domination, and imprisonment without trial, the rights of families to be reunited, the sanctity of ownership of property, and the right of non-belligerent people to live in peace. As we travel from place to place, I still have the booklet in which I made notes during our visit. I have also retained a map of Israel that he provided. There's no indication of a green line between Israel and the West Bank or Gaza, and the map also includes a substantial portion of the Golan Heights and all of the Sinai. There was an expressed desire among some radical Israelis to retain the captured territories, but the prevailing attitude among the nation's leaders was that the occupied lands should be kept only until they could be traded for a secure peace with the Arabs. None of my official briefings included plans for permanent retention or early withdrawal. How the officials of Nazareth were striving to increase tourism and promote economic progress. And in the afternoon we went over to the new city being built to house some of the recent immigrants from the Soviet Union, who seemed to be arriving in a steady stream. The wall paint was hardly dry when each family moved into their new apartment, and there were plans to build 3,000 more units to house those yet to come. Immigration had increased following Israel's victory in the 1967 war, reaching its highest level the year we were there. The mayor said that up to 100 factories around metropolitan Nazareth would provide jobs for both the old and new residents. Some of the longtime citizens complained about the special treatment being given to the newcomers, but these dissident voices were not widespread or persistent. We talked to several of the Soviet settlers who bragged to the younger ones that they had been studying Hebrew from the first day in their new homes. It was especially interesting to visit with some of the few surviving Samaritans who complained to us that their holy sites and culture were not being respected by the Israeli authorities. The same complaint heard by Jesus and his disciples almost 2,000 years earlier. Later we visited several kibbutzim, collective farms or settlements, one of them already 54 years old. As a farmer, I was interested to learn that they grew apples and were able to keep them in cold storage for sale almost year-round, and that their cows were milked 3 times daily, instead of the usual 2 milkings, to increase production and profits. The next morning was a Sabbath, at the appointed time every day, and must never be found wanting. They were convinced that their own kibbutz was valuable both economically and militarily, and made it clear to us that they intended never to have enemy guns firing down on Israelis from these cliffs again. There were only about 1,500 Jewish settlers in the occupied territories at that time, and our natural presumption was that Israel would dismantle the unwanted settlements to comply with international law, including UN Security Council resolutions that had been supported by both Israel and the United States. I knew that Prime Minister Meir had said that there were no separate Palestinian people, but we assumed this to mean that there should be no future racial delineation between Jews and Gentiles. I have to admit that at the time, I equated the ejection of Palestinians from their previous homes within the state of Israel to the forcing of Lower Creek Indians from the Georgia land, where our own family farm was now located. They had been moved west to Oklahoma on the so-called Trail of Tears to make room for our white ancestors. In this most recent case, although equally harsh, the taking of land had been ordained by the international community through an official decision of the United Nations. The Palestinians had to comply, and after all, they could return or be compensated in the future, and they were guaranteed undisputed ownership of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. After going to sea on one of the missile boats that had been spirited from the French, despite the post-1967 arms embargo against Israel, we drove east and then south as close as we could to the Jordan River. All our lives we had studied and sung about this stream, so we visualized a mighty current with almost magical qualities. We were amazed to find it was not as large as the small creeks that flow through our own farm. We learned that much of the water was being diverted from the stream to irrigate Israeli crops, then one of the prime causes of the animosity between Israel and its eastern neighbors. Barbed wire and roadblocks kept us away from the security zone along the river's banks. But with special permission from a border security guard, I took a quick dip in the Jordan River, near where I thought Jesus had been baptized by John the Baptist, a diploma, and I presented a sword of the Spirit, that is, a Hebrew Bible, which is one of the few indications of a religious commitment that I observed during our visit. General Rabin described the close relationship that Israel had with South Africa in the diamond trade. He had returned from there a day or two early to greet us, but commented that the South African system of apartheid could not long survive. When I asked about his own political future, he said that he would have a place on the Labour Party list, but had not yet been assured of a cabinet post. At that time, Foreign Minister Abba Eban was the best-known Israeli. Famous for the eloquence of his speeches at the United Nations, I thanked the Prime Minister for making possible our wonderful visit, and she asked if I had any observations I would like to share. With some hesitation, I said that I had long taught lessons from the Hebrew Scriptures, and that a common historical pattern was that Israel was punished whenever the leaders turned away from their devout worship of God. I asked if she was concerned about the secular nature of her Labour government. She seemed surprised at my temerity and dismissed my comments with a shrug and a laugh. She lit one cigarette after another and then said that Orthodox Jews still existed and could assume that portion of the nation's responsibility. She was referring to the religious Jews in the Israeli parliament, who were sometimes a real thorn in her side. She added, "If you attend a session of the Knesset, you will see them in action, and you will know that they have not lost their faith. With Israel's system of elections, which necessitates a coalition of parties to form a ruling majority, the minority religious organizations had an influence far exceeding their numerical strength." Some of the private and public comments that indicate how the atmosphere in Israel was buoyant with a sense of success and prosperity. And I quote some of those. "The United States is our only important friend. The Russians now want peace in the Middle East. They cannot afford another major defeat of their Arab allies. The Europeans are obsessed with economics. France is our worst enemy in the common market, moralistic to a fault. Arabs are incompatible with us. They have no loyalty to the Israeli flag. Israeli Arabs are the fastest growing community on earth, and it's only Jewish immigration that will let us retain a majority. The Arab oil weapon is not a real threat. They need dollars more than the world needs their oil. Israel receives 90% of its oil needs from the Sinai and Iran. We have no foreseeable problems in obtaining enough fuel. And finally, no one should fear the Arab nations. They have been badly beaten in every conflict and eventually will have to sue for peace." We left convinced that the Israelis were dominant but just, the Arabs quiescent because their rights were being protected, and the political and military situation destined to remain stable until land was swapped for peace. I was excited and optimistic about the apparent commitment of the Israelis to establish a nation that would be a homeland for the Jews, dedicated to the Judeo-Christian principles of peace and justice, and determined to live in harmony with all their neighbors. Was already well developed, but he had not decided on any firm plan to reach what might become our common goal. Sadat told me that he was willing to take bold steps toward peace, all of them based on the prevailing United Nations Security Council resolutions. We discussed some of the specific elements of possible direct negotiations in the future: Israel's permanent boundaries, the status of Jerusalem, Palestinian rights, and, almost inconceivable at the time, free trade and open borders between the two nations, plus full diplomatic recognition and exchange of ambassadors. Menachem Begin replaced Yitzhak Rabin as prime minister a month later, and I quickly learned all I could about Israel's new leader. His surprising victory ended the uninterrupted domination of the Labour Party since Israel's independence. Begin had put together a majority coalition that accepted his premise that the land in Gaza and the West Bank belonged rightfully to the State of Israel and should not be exchanged for a permanent peace agreement with the Arabs. Public opinion varied widely, but there was no doubt in 1977 that a more hawkish attitude now prevailed in the government of Israel. I was deeply concerned, but sent him personal congratulations and an invitation to visit me in Washington. Although many factors had influenced the outcome of the Israeli election, age and ethnic differences strongly favored the Likud over the Labor alignment. Oriental Jews, known as Sephardim, whose families had come from the Middle East and Africa, gave the Likud coalition parties a political margin in 1977, and they were inclined to support a much more militant policy in dealing with the occupied territories. Although Begin was not one of them by birth, his philosophy and demeanor were attractive to the Sephardic voters. Also, the Sephardim were generally younger, more conservative, and nearer the bottom of the economic ladder, and they resented the more prosperous and sophisticated Jewish immigrants from Europe and America, known as Ashkenazim, who had furnished almost all of Israel's previous leaders. The Sephardic families had a higher birth rate than the Ashkenazim, and now, combined with many immigrants, they had become a strong political force in the victory. After he and his family suffered persecution in Eastern Europe and Siberia for his political activity as a Zionist, he was released from a Soviet prison and went to Palestine in 1942. He became the leader of a militant underground group called the Irgun, which espoused the maximum demands of Zionism. These included driving British forces out of Palestine. He fought with every weapon available against the British, who branded him as a preeminent terrorist in the region. A man of personal courage and single-minded devotion to his goals, he took pride in being a fighting Jew. I realized that Israel's new prime minister, with whom I would be dealing, would be prepared to resort to extreme measures to achieve the goals in which he believed. In Israel, Begin put forward clear and blunt answers to complex questions about peace and war, religion, the Palestinians, finance, and economics. I expected him to have a clear idea of when he might yield and what he would not give up in negotiations with his Arab neighbors and the United States. However, when he came to Washington to meet with me, I found the Prime Minister quite willing to pursue some of the major goals that I had discussed with Sadat. I also had definitive discussions with King Hussein of Jordan and President Assad of Syria, but it was obvious that they would not be willing to participate in the kind of peace efforts that Sadat, Begin, and I had discussed. The economic and political pressures among the Arab leaders to maintain a unanimous condemnation of Israel were overwhelming. The PLO was out of diplomatic bounds for me, still officially classified by the United States government as a terrorist organization. Despite this restraint, I sought through unofficial channels to induce Arafat to accept the key UN resolutions so that the PLO could join in peace efforts, but he refused. I sent Sadat a handwritten letter telling him how extremely important, perhaps vital, it was for us to work together, and he and I discussed various possibilities by telephone. In November 1977, Sadat made a dramatic peace initiative by going directly to Jerusalem. Begin received Sadat graciously and listened with apparent composure while the Egyptian president laid down in no uncertain terms the strongest Arab position, which included Israel's immediate withdrawal from all occupied territories and the right of return of Palestinians to their former homes, and 35 Israelis were killed. I publicly condemned this outrageous act, but my sympathy was strained 3 days later when Israel invaded Lebanon and used American-made anti-personnel cluster bombs against Beirut and other urban centers, killing hundreds of civilians and leaving thousands homeless. I consider this major invasion to be an overreaction to the PLO attack, a serious threat to peace in the region, and perhaps part of a plan to establish a permanent Israeli presence in southern Lebanon. Also, such use of American weapons violated a legal requirement that armaments sold by us be used only for Israeli defense against an attack. After consulting with key supporters of Israel in the U.S. Senate, I informed Prime Minister Begin that if Israeli forces remained in Lebanon, I would have to notify Congress, as required by law, that U.S. weapons were being used illegally in Lebanon, which would automatically cut off all military aid to Israel. Also, I instructed the State Department to prepare a UN Security Council resolution condemning Israel's action. Israeli forces withdrew, and United Nations troops came in to replace them in southern Lebanon. He also had a good personal relationship with the Egyptians and would often go by Sadat's cabin for private discussions or a game of backgammon. These peace talks proved to be something of an epiphany for Weizmann, who had been an early member of Begin's Irgun team of Zionist militants, a noted hero of the Six-Day War as director of the early morning strikes that decimated the Arab air forces, and a founder of the conservative Likud political party. He had been a leading hawk all his life, but was converted in the weeks of negotiations into a strong proponent of reconciliation with the Arabs. Without my asking him, Asa Weizmann came to America during my re-election campaign in 1980 and visited several cities, publicly urging. This confirmed the Israelis' fears that their nation's existence would again be threatened as soon as the adversaries could accumulate enough strength to mount a military challenge. For Menachem Begin, the peace treaty with Egypt was a significant act for Israel, while solemn promises regarding the West Bank and Palestinians would be finessed or deliberately violated. With the bilateral treaty, Israel removed Egypt's considerable strength from the military equation of the Middle East, and thus it permitted itself renewed freedom to pursue the goals of a fervent and dedicated minority of its citizens to confiscate, settle, and fortify the occupied territories. Israeli settlement activities still caused great concern, and in 1980, UN Resolution 465, see Appendix 5, calling on Israel to dismantle existing settlements in the Arab territories occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, was passed unanimously. We all knew that Israel must have a comprehensive and lasting peace, and this dream could have been realized if Israel had complied with the Camp David Accords and refrained from colonizing the West Bank. Although not given the same rights as Muslims, both Christians and Jews who lived in Islamic countries often fared better than non-Christians in Christendom, because the Prophet Muhammad commanded his followers to recognize the common origins of their faith through Abraham, to honor their prophets, and to protect their believers. Muslim leaders favored the Jews over Christians because they saw them as less competitive in expanding their political and religious influence. President Anwar Sadat made these points often while he was negotiating with Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and me at Camp David. Nationalism became a powerful force in 19th century Europe, and it influenced Jews living there to create the Zionist movement. In Western Europe, the unique identity of the Jewish population was threatened by assimilation into Christian and secular society. But almost 3/4 of Jews were living in Eastern Europe, where persecution continued, and it was there that the seeds of Zionism were nourished. Although a majority of Jewish immigrants went to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, increasing demands were heard for the establishment of a Jewish state, both to escape oppression and to fulfill an interpretation of biblical prophecies. Although exact data are not available, it is estimated that in 1880 there were only 30,000 Jews in Palestine, scattered among 600,000 Muslim and Christian Arabs. By 1930, their numbers had grown to more than 150,000. Syria depended heavily on Soviet aid, but Assad was not a subservient puppet, and I hoped that he might demonstrate his independence by working with me to overcome some of the obstacles we faced. My own plans for peace talks at that time were based on the same UN resolutions that he emphasized. In order to understand the still prevailing attitudes in the Arab world, even including the more moderate views in Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon, it is useful to summarize the fervent opinions of Assad, which are rarely heard in the Western world. Rosen and I, plus official interpreters, kept careful notes of our conversations. Assad stressed to me that Israel was admitted to the United Nations in 1949 with a clear proviso that Palestinian refugees would be allowed to return to their homeland or be fully compensated for their lost property. Prior to 1967, he said, Israel was steadily forcing additional Arab inhabitants from their small remaining territory in violation of UN agreements that the Israelis had sworn to honor, and he claimed that they initiated the 1967 war in order to take even more Arab land. He quoted key Israeli leaders who had announced that this was just an intermediate step toward an ultimate greater Israel, and every action since that time, he said, had demonstrated their expansionist commitments. Assad was convinced that the Israelis did not want peace and would always frustrate negotiations as they expanded geographically. He emphasized that, as a matter of principle, no Arab leader could ever agree to any extension of Israel's legal borders, no matter how great his desire for peace. I tried to convince Assad that the Israelis were ready for peace if Arab leaders were willing to negotiate with them directly and in good faith. I described the overwhelming commitment of the Israelis to the security of their small nation, and there. But Jordan and Israel had concluded a peace treaty 5 years earlier. He was very frail, with only a year to live, not long enough to see his son, President Bashar al-Assad, remove all Syrian troops from Lebanon in 2005. I made a visit to the Middle East early in 2005 and planned to visit the young Syrian president in Damascus. As usual, I notified the White House well in advance of my itinerary and immediately received a call from the National Security Advisor, who informed me that I would not receive approval for this portion of my trip. Because of differences with Syria concerning U.S. policy in Iraq, a decision had been made to withdraw our ambassador and to isolate President Assad by prohibiting visits by prominent Americans. I tried to explain that I had known Bashar since he was a university student, that I would be glad to use my influence to resolve any outstanding problems, as I had done with his father. In a somewhat heated conversation, I also expressed my view that refusing to communicate with leaders with whom we disagreed was counterproductive. Reluctantly, I complied with the directive. Later, I observed that President Assad was denied a visa to attend a UN General Assembly summit meeting in New York. Despite this effort to embarrass and weaken Bashar al-Assad, he has survived for 6 years in one of the most difficult political posts in the region. It is quite likely that he has been pushed into stronger alliances with anti-American forces in Iraq, Iran, and Lebanon. When an international peace effort is launched to end the current conflict between Israel and Lebanon, Syria may once again play a major role. And now let's turn to Jordan. When Rosa and I first saw Jordan in the spring of 1973, we were looking through barbed wire. From the west, our family has always enjoyed visiting Egypt, to cruise on the Nile, travel through the countryside, examine the ancient sites, and meet with political leaders. We still receive the warmest of welcomes, but it has not been the same for us since Sadat. Of almost 100 heads of state with whom I met while president, he was my favorite and my closest personal friend. In fact, our wives and 2 other generations of our families also forged close relationships. We made a special trip to Sadat's home village after his death to repay a visit he had made to our home in Plains. And now Lebanon. Until the most recent outbreak of Lebanon and Israel, circumstances in Lebanon had been a minor factor in the ongoing dispute between Israelis and Palestinians, but it is useful to review previous events in order to understand the causes of conflict and the potential for peace. Lebanon has long had to accommodate religious and political divisions, with a Christian majority at the time of its formation under French control at the end of World War I, and a growing Muslim influence. The mountainous terrain permitted the different religious communities to live in relative isolation and to preserve their identity and autonomy through the centuries, even when ruled by the Ottoman Empire. A constitution was evolved in 1926 under the French mandate that provided for the president to be chosen by a 2/3 vote of the National Assembly and by unwritten custom to be a Maronite Christian, with the prime minister a Sunni Muslim and the speaker of the parliament a Shia Muslim. Other government posts were divided among the Druze, Greek Orthodox, and Greek Catholics. Israel's bombing of Lebanese cities caused high civilian casualties and aroused intense opposition, even within Israel. Israel's Maronite Christian ally, Bashir Gemayel, was elected president of Lebanon, and under pressure from Washington, the Israelis made a partial withdrawal to the south, while American and European troops entered Beirut to supervise the forced departure of Arafat and several thousand of his PLO troops. Then, in quick succession, Western peacekeeping forces left Beirut, considering the crisis to be resolved. President Gemayel was assassinated, and Israeli military forces returned to the city and its suburbs. A few days later, more than 1,000 non-combatant Palestinian and Lebanese Muslims were slain in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps controlled by Israel's allies, for which Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon was held accountable. American, British, French, and Italian troops moved back into Beirut. The Israeli forces around Beirut were under constant attack from Lebanese, who were supported by Syria, and casualties were high. In September 1983, the Israelis again withdrew to southern Lebanon, with one of their goals accomplished. The PLO forces in Beirut was known to be a strong critic of Syria's decisions concerning the Lebanese government. Massive demonstrations followed, and Syria withdrew the remainder of its military forces. The slain Prime Minister's son, Saad, was elected to head the government. To the relief of many, Lebanon was no longer on center stage, and the light of world attention could be focused elsewhere in the Middle East. These dreams were to be shattered in July 2006, as will be described later in chapter 16. Saudi Arabia. Although not contiguous to Israel, Saudi Arabia will play an important role in any permanent peace agreement in the region. Because it is a rich nation with major oil reserves, keeper of the Muslim holy places, with diplomatic ties to almost all of the nations and playing a preeminent role in the Arab League, its stabilizing influence has always been crucial. As president, I had strong but private encouragement from Saudi leaders for my peace initiatives, even when their public statements were quite different. Saudi Arabia is a strange country to many Westerners, reminiscent of the Arabian Nights, geographically isolated, ruled by hundreds of princes who are floating in wealth and having enjoyed a close political relationship with the United States since the time of King Abdul Aziz and President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Although we found the major cities very interesting, Rosen and I had our most informative visit with King Fahd ibn Abd in 1983 while he was having one of the customary royal sessions with his subjects, this time in a remote desert area about 200 kilometers north of Riyadh. In a tent city erected for this purpose, chieftains had assembled to meet with their monarch and to report on their travel affairs and to request goods and services for their people. While I was with the men, Rosen was whisked off to visit Saudi women, who were in a different camp entirely, over the sand dunes and out of independent and volatile leaders in a divided Arab world. I might add that the Saudis and many others greatly overestimate the influence of the United States, and they never understand why we cannot deliver our own friends in the Middle East when it suits our purposes. The leaders of Saudi Arabia can be a crucial and beneficial force in the Middle East, whenever their influence might make the difference in bringing peace and stability to the region as an alternative to war and continuing political turmoil. At least among American leaders, there has been a willingness to overlook in Saudi Arabia serious human rights violations that we would condemn in other nations. Chapter 6, The Reagan Years, 1981 to 1989. In addition to my involvement while president, I observed very carefully the developments in the Middle East during the following years and visited the region several times to consult with political leaders, academics, and private citizens. These activities were part of the programs of the Carter Center, an organization that my wife Rosen and I founded to address issues that we considered to be important to our own country and to others. Our center now has projects in 65 nations, including 35 in Africa, dealing with health, agriculture, the enhancement of democracy, and the promotion of peace. President Reagan knew that the Middle East could be stable only if Israel could have lasting peace with her neighbors, and that this would not be possible if the occupied territories were retained and colonized. Our team at the Carter Center continued to monitor the interrelated events in the Middle East, always with the goal of keeping alive the faltering peace process. Two events discouraged any strong and sustained Middle East peace efforts by the United States. In 1986, leaders in Washington were embarrassed when it was disclosed that Israeli intermediaries had assisted the United States in exchanging weapons to Iran for the release of U.S. hostages being held in Lebanon, with proceeds from the arms sales used to support the Contra War in Nicaragua. And late in 1987, the Likud settlement policy in the occupied territories increased confrontations between Jews and Arabs, and harsher treatment of dissidents led to an outbreak of organized civil violence. Known as the Intifada, this sustained, independent, and forceful action of young Palestinians surprised both the Israelis and the PLO. My first visit to Israel after leaving the White House illustrates how circumstances and attitudes had changed since I was there as governor 10 years earlier and as president in the late 1970s. On arriving in Jerusalem in the spring of 1983, Rose and I paid our third visit to the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial, where we heard expressions of gratitude that the negotiations at Camp David had led to peace with Egypt. A few minutes later, I was on my way to Prime Minister Begin's office in Israel's Parliament building. As a private citizen, I expected that my personal relationship with Israeli leaders, and especially with Prime Minister Begin, would be different. Although his nation and mine shared many beliefs and political goals, he and I had frequently been at odds across the negotiating table. It was no secret that Begin and I had strong public disagreements concerning the interpretation of the Camp David Accords and Israel's recent invasion of Lebanon. Unfortunately, these disputes had resulted in some personal differences as well. Now we were together again, and as had always been my custom, I expressed myself with frankness on some of the more controversial issues. I first congratulated Begin on the manner in which he had honored the difficult terms of the peace treaty concerning the withdrawal of Israeli forces and dismantling of settlements in Egypt's Sinai. Then, as he sat without looking at me, I explained again why we believed he had not honored a commitment made during the peace negotiations to withdraw Israeli forces and to refrain from building new Israeli settlements in the West Bank. I described my disappointment that he had not been willing to grant the Palestinians any appreciable degree of independence or responsibility in the occupied territories, and I urged him to make it plain to the Egyptians and Jordanians that Israel would observe the basic elements of UN Resolution 242, crucial commitments that he and I had both made to our people. I paused, expecting the Prime Minister to give his usual strong explanation of Israeli policy. He responded with just a few words, in a surprisingly perfunctory way, and made it plain that our conversation should be concluded. I did not know whether I had aggravated him more than usual, whether he wanted to reserve his arguments for current American officials, or whether he was preoccupied. Most likely, it was a combination of all three reasons. Palestinians away from the holy sites, often beating those they consider to be trespassers, expanding their area by confiscating adjacent homes and deliberately creating physical confrontations. When this occurs, the troops impose long curfews on the 150,000 Palestinian citizens of Hebron, prohibiting them from leaving their own homes to go to school or shops or to participate in the normal life of an urban community. The Palestinians claimed that the undisguised purpose of this harassment was to drive non-Jews from the area. The United Nations reported that more than 150 Israeli checkpoints had been established in and around the city. These Palestinians were convinced that some Israeli political leaders were trying through harassment to force a much broader exodus of Muslims and Christians from the occupied territories. They claimed that any manufactured goods or farm products were not permitted to be sold in Israel if they competed with Israeli produce. So any surplus had to be given away, dumped, or exported to Jordan. The fruit, flowers, and perishable vegetables of the more activist families were often held at the Allenby Bridge until they spoiled, and in some areas the farmers were not permitted to replace fruit trees that died in their orchards. Their most anguished complaints were about many thousands of ancient olive trees that were being cut down by the Israelis. Access to water was a persistent issue. Each Israeli settler uses 5 times as much water as a Palestinian neighbor, who must pay 4 times as much per gallon. They showed us photographs of Israeli swimming pools adjacent to Palestinian villages where drinking water had to be hauled in on tanker trucks and dispensed by the bucketful. Most of the hilltop settlements were on small areas of land, so untreated sewage is discharged into the surrounding fields and villages. Teachers and parents maintained that their schools and universities were frequently closed, educators arrested, bookstores padlocked, library books censored, and students left on the streets or at home for extended periods of time without jobs. They claimed that any serious altercation between these idle and angry young people and the military authorities could result in the sending of bulldozers into the community to destroy homes. Predictably, the Palestinians professed to deplore all acts of violence and claimed that militant Israeli settlers were as guilty as any Arabs in initiating attacks, but were seldom, if ever, arrested or punished. One of their most bitter grievances was that foreign aid from Arab countries, and even funds sent by the American government for humanitarian purposes, were intercepted by the authorities and used for the benefit of the Israelis, including the construction of settlements in Palestinian communities. They claimed that the government had seized U.S. Agency for International Development funds, USAID funds, intended for a center for retarded children in Gaza, and that Jordanian and other Arab money intended for education and the development of a poultry industry in some of the poorer communities in the West Bank was being withheld. I was disturbed by these reports and wanted to determine if they were accurate, and, if so, to hear an explanation from the Israeli authorities. Before leaving Israel, I met at length with our own diplomatic officials in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and with the Israelis who administered affairs in the occupied territories. From the Israeli point of view, life under a military occupation was inevitably going to be different from that in a free democracy, and severe restrictions were considered necessary to forestall acts of violence. As far as the harassment of activists was concerned, I was told that there were often extended delays at the Allenby Bridge entering Jordan, but these were not designed to punish any particular families. This situation was the inevitable result of constraints on commercial traffic between two countries that did not have normal trade or diplomatic relations. Lists were kept of troublemakers, and shipments from their families received more intense inspection that sometimes resulted in their spoilage. Also, it was true that Israeli products of all kinds had first priority for sales throughout the territory. Israeli officials said that the destruction of an Arab home with dynamite or bulldozers was a rare, deliberate, and highly publicized event, designed to serve as an effective deterrent to adults who might permit or encourage illegal acts by younger members of their families. Most of the Israeli responses were forthright, but one exception was the interception of foreign aid money by the Israelis, who claimed that some of the confiscated funds might have been diverted to finance acts of Arab terrorism, and that Israeli control must be sufficient to prevent abuses that could threaten the peace. They also acknowledged a concern about surplus chickens, oranges, flowers, grapes, olives, or other agricultural goods being produced in the West Bank and Gaza that might damage the Israeli farm economy. It did not make sense for foreign money to be used to increase such agricultural production. I was told that some USAID funds appropriated by the U.S. Congress, even for benevolent projects, were kept by the Israeli government when necessary to prevent misspending, but that this withheld money was not used to build Israeli settlements in the occupied territory. The Israelis told me that in every instance there was a legal basis for the taking of land, or that it was needed for security purposes. In some key cases, administrative definitions had served to circumvent or modify legal decisions. Later, I received a briefing from Meron Benvenisti, an Israeli who had served as deputy mayor of Jerusalem and was devoting his full time to a definitive analysis of Israel's policies in the occupied territories. With maps and charts, he explained that the Israelis acquired Palestinian lands in a number of different ways: by direct purchase, through seizure, for security purposes for the duration of the occupation, by claiming state control of areas formerly held by the Jordanian government, by taking under some carefully selected Arabic customs or ancient law. At this late hour, after midnight, I was surprised to receive custodians of the Christian holy places, plus cardinals, archbishops, patriarchs, and other leaders of the Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Armenian, Coptic, Ethiopian Orthodox, Maronite, Anglican, Lutheran, Baptist, and other faiths. They were distressed by what they considered to be increasing abuse and unwarranted constraints imposed on them by the Israeli government, and each of them related events that caused him concern. Subsequently, when I met with Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, he assured me that there was no official inclination to discriminate against Christians. He went on to explain that the formation of a majority governing coalition required support of the smaller, deeply religious parties, and their primary demands were that they be excused from military service, receive special funding for benevolent causes, and have authority over all religious matters. He seemed to consider these matters out of his hands, and I understood for the first time why there was such a surprising exodus of Christians from the Holy Land. Chapter 8. The George H.W. Bush Years. Peace prospects seemed to improve in July 1988. Arafat publicly disavowed terrorism as a means to achieve PLO goals and agreed that, with the formation of an independent Palestinian state, normal relations with Israel would be acceptable. Based on these statements, United States diplomats began exploratory talks with PLO officials. The glasnost policies of Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev helped to end the Cold War, making it possible for the two superpowers to cooperate, and at the same time, Syria and other Arab nations lost their strong political and military support from Moscow and became more willing to ease tensions in the region. Arab leaders accepted Egypt back into the Arab League in May 1989, and that same year, the USSR permitted hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews to immigrate to Israel. Secretary of State James Baker understood the need to ease tension in the Middle East, and in May 1990 stated to the annual convention of the powerful pro-Israeli lobbying organization, AIPAC, the basic requirement for peace. Quote, "Now is the time to lay aside, once and for all, the unrealistic vision of a greater Israel. Forswear annexation, stop settlement activity. Reach out to the Palestinians as neighbors who deserve political rights." Unquote. These statements had a beneficial impact in the Middle East. For instance, when I visited Damascus in 1990, President Assad informed me that he was willing to negotiate with Israel on the status of the Golan Heights. His proposal was that both sides withdraw from an international border, with a small force of foreign observers and electronic devices to monitor the neutral zone. When I asked him if each nation would have to fall back an equal distance, he replied that Syria might move its troops further from the border because of the terrain. He also gave me permission to report his proposal to Washington and to the Israelis, which I did in Jerusalem 3 days later. The following month, I met with Yasser Arafat and other PLO leaders in Paris, where they all agreed to accept the Camp David Accords as a basis for future negotiations with the Israelis. As usual, I reported these conversations to the White House and State Department, but Washington was almost totally preoccupied with the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait. There was no sustained American leadership in the Middle East peace process until after the Gulf War against Iraq in the spring of 1991, when Baker made several trips to the region. This resumption made possible a peace conference in Madrid in October 1991, convened jointly by the United States and the Soviet Union, and attended by Israel, several Arab countries including Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, and Palestinians from the occupied territories. Subsequently, more than a dozen formal rounds of bilateral talks were hosted by the United States, aimed at peace agreements between Israel and its immediate neighbors. The discussions between Israel and the Palestinians addressed a 5-year interim agreement, with hopes of negotiations on the permanent status issues. Although the Madrid effort brought no specific resolution of the issues, the willingness of the participants to communicate with one another greatly reduced regional tensions and renewed hope of future progress toward peace. Still, Israel put confiscation of Palestinian land ahead of peace, provoking an official White House statement, and I quote, "The United States has opposed and will continue to oppose settlement activity in territories occupied in 1967, which remain an obstacle to peace." Unquote. From the State Department, Secretary Baker added, and I quote, "I don't think there is any greater obstacle to peace than settlement activity that continues, not only unabated, but at an advanced pace, unquote. As further proof of his seriousness, President George H.W. Bush demanded a freeze on settlement housing being built or planned, especially a large complex between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. When he finally threatened to withhold a portion of the $10 million daily aid package, plus loan guarantees from the United States, the Israeli government complied, and the U.S. grants and loans were approved, but with a deduction of $400 million, the amount that Israel had already spent on settlement activity. Later, after President Bush was no longer in office, I noticed that this major settlement was being rapidly completed. Political leadership in Israel changed several times during this period, including formation of national unity governments that shifted authority back and forth between Labor and Likud leaders. After an election victory in June 1992, the Labor Party was able to form a coalition under the leadership of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin without Likud participation. Israel then made clear its desire to reconcile differences with the Palestinians, Syria, and its other neighbors, and the Arab response was surprisingly positive. Chapter 9. The Oslo Agreement. It was during this period of relative goodwill under Rabin's leadership that, without America's involvement, Norway's Foreign Minister Johan Holst, Professor Terje Larsen, and their wives helped to orchestrate highly secret peace talks between the government of Israel and the PLO. Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres and Deputy Foreign Minister Yossi Beilin had a series of more than a dozen sessions, mostly in Oslo, with PLO leader Yasser Arafat's team, headed by Mahmoud Abbas, who's known as Abu Mazen, and Ahmad Kurey, known as Abu Allah. During the early months of 1993, both Peres and Arafat kept me informed about these efforts. I was in the northern part of Yemen in August 1993 when I received an urgent request from Arafat to meet him in Tirana. I returned to the capital city by helicopter and found the PLO leader almost beside himself with excitement. He told me that the peace talks had been successful and that the Israelis were flying to the United States at that time to inform the Clinton administration about the achievement. Above all else, Arafat emphasized the provision in the agreement that called for the formation of a Palestinian national authority with the election of a president and members of a national assembly. A few weeks later, Rosa and I were invited to a signing ceremony at the White House, where President Bill Clinton presided, and Prime Minister Rabin and Chairman Arafat were to make a public declaration of peace. I was ushered to a prominent seat among the observers, along with the other public officials, and my wife was a row or two behind me. I was surprised and embarrassed to see the Norwegians, Holst and Larsen, fall back in the crowd, and to notice that their key role in the peace effort was never mentioned. In sum, the Oslo Agreement provided for a phased withdrawal of Israeli military forces from the West Bank, the establishment of a Palestinian governing authority with officials to be elected, and a 5-year interim period during which the more difficult and specific issues would be negotiated. Although Rabin, Peres, and Arafat all received the Nobel Peace Prize for their historic achievement, there was strong opposition from radical elements on both sides. As part of the agreement, in September 1993, Chairman Arafat sent a letter to Prime Minister Rabin, in which he stated unequivocally that the PLO recognized the right of Israel to exist in peace and security, accepted UN Security Council resolutions 242 and 338, committed itself to a peaceful resolution of the conflict, renounced the use of terrorism and other acts of violence, affirmed that those articles of the PLO covenant that deny Israel's right to exist were no longer valid, and promised to submit these commitments to the Palestinian National Council for formal changes to the covenant. Although Israel recognized the PLO as the sole representative of the Palestinians in the peace negotiations and promised 5 years of further progress, Arafat had failed to obtain other specific concessions concerning a timetable for Israel's withdrawal from the occupied territories. In effect, what he got from the Oslo Agreement was the assurance of organizing a form of Palestinian government and staying in power so that he could administer Palestinian affairs in the West Bank and Gaza. The Israelis wanted and achieved much more. It must be remembered that the status of Israelis in the West Bank and Gaza had changed dramatically in 1987 with the first Intifada. Earlier, Israeli Jews in the West Bank had almost complete freedom of safe movement and required minimum military protection. About 10,000 troops in all the occupied territories. The relatively harmonious administration of local affairs by respected Palestinian notables already had been replaced in 1981 by Ariel Sharon with some so-called village leagues, often composed of outcast Palestinians who were willing to be hired by the Israelis. Dissension and danger prevailed. By 1988, no Israeli could travel in the area without Palestinian guides and some prior assurances of safe passage, and 180,000 Israeli troops were deployed to protect settlers and preserve the peace. With the Oslo Agreement, Israel's plan was that Arafat and the PLO would assume responsibility for local administration, free to receive and distribute, or perhaps retain a portion of, the international financial support that would be available to the Palestinians. Following Oslo, Prime Minister Rabin emphasized that the agreement for which he had been honored had avoided the tight restrictions accepted by Menachem Begin at Camp David. And I'll quote what he said. "We ourselves obtained this concession from the Palestinians, from those with whom one should make such deals, without any American promises as in the Camp David agreements. Jewish settlements will be placed under an exclusive Israeli jurisdiction. The Palestinian Autonomy Council will have no authority over them. The forces of the Israeli army will be redeployed in locations determined only by us, unlike the Camp David agreements, which mandated a withdrawal of the Israeli armed forces. In the agreement we reached, we didn't consent to use the formula withdrawal of Israeli army forces, except when it applied to the Gaza Strip. In application to all other places, the only term used is redeployment. I prefer that the Palestinians cope with the problem of enforcing order in Gaza," Rabin went on to say. "The Palestinians will be better at it than we were, because they will allow no appeals to the Supreme Court and will prevent the Israeli Association for Civil Rights from criticizing the conditions there." Chapter 10, The Palestinian Election, 1996. When we arrived there in January 1996, it was obvious that the Israelis had almost complete control over every aspect of political, military, and economic existence of the Palestinians within the West Bank and Gaza. Israeli settlements permeated the occupied territories, and highways connecting the settlements with one another and with Jerusalem were being rapidly built, with Palestinians prohibited from using or crossing some of the key roads. In addition, more than 100 permanent Israeli checkpoints obstructed the routes still open to Palestinian traffic, either pedestrian or vehicular. After meeting with other members of our observer team, I had sessions with American diplomats, Palestinian pollsters, political candidates, and members of the Election Commission. I learned that the commission had been in existence for only 4 weeks, and that political candidates had just 3 weeks to campaign. But 700 had qualified for the 88 parliamentary seats, 6 of which were set aside for Christians and 1 for Samaritan. Only Arafat and a relatively unknown woman named Samiha Khalil had qualified for the presidency. There were many problems, which I discussed with Prime Minister Shimon Peres and General Yuri Dayan, who was responsible for security in the West Bank and Gaza. They assured me that key checkpoints would be opened, Israeli soldiers would not enter voting places, and voters would not be intimidated. I had seen many posters in East Jerusalem that threatened any Arab voters with the loss of their identification cards, housing permits, and social services. Israeli leaders who told me that a militant religious group had posted the warnings promised to remove as many of them as possible. The biggest problem related to East Jerusalem, which Palestinians and the international community consider to be their occupied territory, and Israelis claim as an integral part of their nation. The key question concerning the election was whether Palestinians living in East Jerusalem were voting as residents or as aliens who were casting absentee ballots to be counted outside the disputed area. There were about 200,000 resident Arabs, only about 4,000 of whom would be given permits to vote, and then only in 5 post offices, 4 of them quite small. Of about 120,000 registered voters, the others who had adequate determination and transportation might find their way outside Jerusalem to nearby polling sites in suburban villages, including the Mount of Olives, Ramallah, Bethany, and Bethlehem. This was a very sensitive political issue, and a failure to resolve it threatened the conduct of the election. Quite early, there were few voters in East Jerusalem, and about 50 uniformed Israeli police were around the entrances and even within the post offices, ostentatiously videotaping the face of every Palestinian who was standing in line to cast a ballot. 2 domestic observers who appeared at the largest post office with their proper credentials were arrested, and one was beaten on the way to jail. This news spread like wildfire throughout Jerusalem. At the main checkpoint where the Palestinians were going outside the city to vote, a young captain told me that his orders were to record every name. I called General Dayan to report these problems, and the checkpoints were finally opened. But it was around noon before the police numbers at the Jerusalem sites were reduced and the final video cameras put away. Dayan's reasoning was that they were restraining right-wing Israelis to prevent violence, but it was obvious that the Palestinian voters were intimidated. The new leader of Israel promised never to exchange land for peace. Foreign Minister Ariel Sharon declared the Oslo Agreement to be national suicide and stated, "Everybody has to move, run, and grab as many hilltops as they can to enlarge the settlements, because everything we take now will stay ours. Everything we don't grab will go to them." This policy precipitated Israel's tightened hold on the occupied territories and aroused further violence from the Palestinians. With Arafat now an officially elected leader, President Bill Clinton made a strong and sustained effort to find some reasonable accommodation between Israelis and Palestinians. A 9-day summit conference was convened at Y Plantation in Maryland in October 1998, during which some agreements were reached involving redeployment of Israeli troops and to be leased and portions of the Jordan River Valley and East Jerusalem. The percentage figure is misleading, since it usually includes only the actual footprints of the settlements. There is a zone with a radius of about 400 meters around each settlement, within which Palestinians cannot enter. In addition, there are other large areas that would have to be taken or earmarked to be used exclusively by Israel, roadways that connect the settlements to one another and to Jerusalem, and so-called life arteries that provide the settlers with water, sewage, electricity, and communications. These range in width from 500 to 4,000 meters, and Palestinians cannot cross or use many of these connecting links. This honeycomb of settlements and their interconnecting conduits effectively divide the West Bank into at least 2 non-contiguous areas and multiple fragments, often uninhabitable or even unreachable, and control of the Jordan River Valley denies Palestinians any direct access eastward into Jordan. About 100 military checkpoints completely surround Palestine and block routes going into or between Palestinian communities, combined with an uncountable number of other roads that are permanently closed with large concrete cubes or mounds of earth and rocks. There was no possibility that any Palestinian leader could accept such terms and survive of our negotiations, emphasizing no unilateral actions. President George Bush responded, and I quote, "I'm also pleased to be with Prime Minister Abbas. He represents a cause of freedom and statehood for the Palestinian people. I strongly support that cause. In addition, Prime Minister Sharon has stated that no unilateral actions by either side can or should prejudge the outcome of future negotiations." Unquote. Abbas resigned from his post in October, citing his exclusion from substantive peace efforts by Israel and the United States, and some opposition to his role from within the PLO. Although the initial proposals and timetable for the roadmap for peace have been largely ignored or abandoned, the statement on basic elements of a permanent two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have been retained by the Quartet members, including the end of the occupation begun in 1967 and full commitment to the key UN resolutions. The International Quartet realizes that Israel must have a lasting and comprehensive peace. This will not be possible unless Israel accepts the terms of the roadmap and reverses its colonizing the internationally recognized Palestinian territory, and unless the Palestinians respond by accepting Israel's right to exist, free of violence. Chapter 13, the Geneva Initiative. With concerted peace talks going nowhere after Ariel Sharon and George W. Bush took office, a group of Israelis and Palestinians continued to build upon the Taba talks that had been held during the final days of the Clinton administration. Leaders of the effort were former Israeli Deputy Prime Minister Beilin and former Palestinian Minister of Information and Culture Yasser Abed Rabo. In October 2001, I had a call from Beilin, an experienced political leader who had been in the forefront of peace efforts, including the Oslo negotiations and those of more recent years. He had consulted with his associates in Egypt and the PLO, who suggested that I might be of help in resolving some differences that had arisen in the negotiations without consultation with the Palestinian leaders. This proposal was welcomed by the United States and approved by most Palestinians. Living among 1.3 million Palestinians, the 8,000 Israeli settlers in Gaza were controlling 40% of the arable land and more than one-half the water resources, and 12,000 troops were required to defend their presence. Chapter 14, the Palestinian election of 2005. Yasser Arafat died in November 2004, and the Palestinian law required that his successor be elected within a few weeks. Once again, the Carter Center was asked to observe the process, with the National Democratic Institute as a partner. I arrived in Israel on January 6, 2005, and my first meeting was with Prime Minister Sharon, who immediately expressed confidence that he had sufficient votes in the Knesset to overcome opposition to the Gaza withdrawal. He acknowledged Israel's right to exist and insisted on the right to use violence against Israelis, whom they considered to be enemies occupying their land. It was on this trip that we saw the most disturbing intrusions of the Great Dividing Wall being built by the Israelis, which I will address more thoroughly in Chapter 16. Described as a, quote, security fence, unquote, whose declared function was to deter Palestinian attacks against Israelis, its other purpose became clear as we observed its construction and examined maps of the barrier's ultimate path through Palestine. Including the Israeli-occupied Jordan River Valley, the wall would take in large areas of land for Israel and encircle the Palestinians who remained in their small remnant of the West Bank. This would severely restrict Palestinian access to the outside world. Imprisonment wall is more descriptive than security fence. After returning to America, I went to the White House and gave a personal report to President Bush, emphasizing my concern about Israel's rejection of the roadmap's terms and the building of the wall. I also relayed Mahmoud Abbas's desire to begin comprehensive peace talks at an early date. The President repeated his commitment to the roadmap and said that his new Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, was taking office that same day. And now Lebanon. Until the most recent outbreak of violence between Lebanon and Israel, circumstances in Lebanon had been a minor factor in the ongoing dispute between Israelis and Palestinians, but it is useful to review previous events in order to understand the causes of conflict and the potential for peace today, and that one of her top priorities would be a persistent and aggressive search for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. The Israeli settlers were removed from Gaza in August 2005, with 50,000 troops there to minimize violence. This left behind the Arab inhabitants of a tiny area. There was some predictable controversy in Israel, with extreme right-wingers bitterly opposed to any withdrawals of Israeli settlers, and with some peace groups claiming that unilateral actions would lead to the abandonment of long-range peace proposals. Let's take a quick look at Gaza. Its population has soared in recent years as Palestinian refugees have poured in from other areas occupied by Israel. In 1948, there were only 90,000 natives. The population more than tripled by 1967, and there are now more than 1.4 million, 3,700 people living within each square kilometer. Although there are metropolitan areas with greater population density, such as downtown Manhattan, this is supposed to be a self-sufficient entity, similar to a small and isolated state. separated from the West Bank by 40 kilometers of Israeli territory. Gaza has maintained a population growth rate of 4.7% annually, one of the highest in the world. So more than half its people are less than 15 years old. They are being strangled since the Israeli withdrawal, surrounded by a separation barrier that is penetrated only by Israeli-controlled checkpoints, with just a single opening for personnel only into Egypt's Sinai as their access to the outside world. There have been no moves by Israel to permit transportation by air or by sea. Fishermen are not permitted to leave the harbor. Workers are prevented from going to outside jobs. The import or export of food and other goods is severely restricted and often cut off completely. And the police, teachers, nurses, and social workers are deprived of salaries. Per capita income has decreased 40% during the last 3 years, and the poverty rate has reached 70%. The UN Special Rapporteur on the right of food has stated that the acute malnutrition in Gaza is already on the same scale as that seen in the poorer countries of the southern Sahara, with more than half of all Palestinian families eating only one meal a day. Late results from both Israeli and Palestinian pollsters indicated that about 35% of the parliamentary seats would go to Hamas candidates. Israel had announced that without a dramatic moderation of its policies, even this involvement by Hamas would preclude any initiation of substantive peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians, was promoted by Israeli moderates as a means of preventing intrusive attacks after the withdrawal of Israel's occupied forces. The first barrier surrounding Gaza proved that this was a valid premise, in that there was a substantial decrease in cross-border raids. The plan was to continue construction of the barrier along the border between Israel and the West Bank. But instead, the governments of Ariel Sharon and Ehud Olmert have built the fence and wall entirely within Palestinian territory, intruding deeply into the West Bank to encompass Israeli settlement blocks and large areas of other Palestinian land. It is projected to be at least 3.5 times as long as Israel's internationally recognized border, and already cuts directly through Palestinian villages, divides families from their gardens and farmland, and includes 375,000 Palestinians on the Israeli side of the wall, 175,000 of whom are outside Jerusalem. One example is that the Wandering Wall almost completely surrounds the Palestinian city of Qalqiliyah with its 45,000 inhabitants, with most of its citizens' land and about 1/3 of their water supply confiscated by the Israelis. Almost the same encirclement has occurred around 170,000 citizens of Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus. To construct the wall, first a wide swath must be bulldozed through communities before the wall can be built. In addition to the concrete and electrified fencing materials used in the construction, the barrier includes 2-meter-deep trenches, roads for patrol vehicles, electronic ground and fence sensors, thermal imaging and video cameras, sniper towers, and razor wire, all on Palestinian land. The area between the segregation barrier and the Israeli border has been designated a closed military region for an indefinite period of time. Israeli directives state that every Palestinian over the age of 12 living in the closed area has to obtain a permanent resident permit from the civil administration to enable them to continue to live in their own homes. They are considered to be aliens without the rights of Israeli citizens. To summarize, whatever territory Israel decides to confiscate will be on its side of the wall. But Israelis will still retain control of the Palestinians who will be on the other side of the barrier, enclosed between it and Israel's forces in the Jordan River Valley. President George W. Bush said, quote, "I think the wall is a problem. It is very difficult to develop confidence between the Palestinians and the Israelis with a wall snaking through the West Bank," unquote. Since 1945, the International Court of Justice has functioned essentially as the judicial arm of the United Nations system, and in July 2004 the court determined that the Israeli government's construction of the segregation wall in the occupied Palestinian West Bank was illegal. Even Thomas Bergenthal, the American judge who cast a lone negative vote, largely on procedural grounds, acknowledged that the Palestinians were under occupation and had the right to self-determination, that Israel was obligated to adhere to international humanitarian law, and that there were serious questions whether routing an impenetrable barrier to protect West Bank settlements would qualify as legitimate self-defense. The court acknowledged Israel's right to protect the lives of its citizens by building a protective barrier within its own national border, but based its negative ruling on international law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention, which forbids an occupying power from transferring any parts of its civilian population a permanent resident permit. And I quote, "The wall is not separating Palestinians from Jews, rather Palestinians from Palestinians," unquote. Nearby are 3 convents that will also be cut off from the people they serve. These 2,000 Palestinian Christians have lost their place of worship. Chapter 10, the Palestinian election 1996, and their spiritual center. In addition to cutting off about 200,000 Palestinians in Jerusalem from their relatives, property, schools, and businesses, the wall is designed to complete the enclosure of a severely truncated Palestine, a small portion of its original size, compartmentalized, divided into cantons, occupied by Israeli security forces, and isolated from the outside world. In addition, a network of exclusive highways is being built across even these fragments of the West Bank to connect the new Greater Israel in the west with the occupied Jordan River Valley in the east, where 7,000 Jews are living in 21 heavily protected settlements, among about 50,000 Palestinians who are still permitted to stay there. The area along the Jordan River, which is now planned as the eastern leg of the encirclement of the Palestinians, is one of Palestine's most lucrative and productive agricultural regions. Most of its inhabitants were forcefully evicted in 1967, and the Israelis have not allowed these original families to return. Israeli customs officers keep lists of their names and are careful to prohibit their crossing any international checkpoint into the occupied territory, where they might lay claim to their homes and farmland. The best description of the barrier, its routing and impact, is shown in the film The Iron Wall, produced by the Palestinian Agricultural Relief Committees in 2004. International human rights organizations estimate that since 1967, more than 630,000 Palestinians, about 20% of a total population, in the occupied territories have been detained at some time by the Israelis, arousing deep resentment among the families involved. Although the vast majority of prisoners are men, there are a large number of women and children being held. Between the ages of 12 and 14, children can be sentenced for a period of up to 6 months, and after the age of 14, Palestinian children are tried as adults, a violation of international law. In addition to time in jail, the pre-trial periods can be quite lengthy. Under special Israeli laws governing the period before sentencing, Palestinian detainees can be interrogated for a total period of 180 days and denied lawyer visits for intervals of 90 days at a time. So-called administrative detention is indefinitely renewable under military regulations. Confessions extracted through torture are admissible in Israeli courts. Accused persons usually are tried in military courts in the West Bank and then incarcerated in prisons inside Israel. This means that both family visits and access to lawyers are prohibited during the frequent and extended times of tight travel restraints. The Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits this policy, stating, quote, "Protected persons accused of offenses shall be retained in the occupied country, and if convicted, they shall serve their sentences therein." The cycle of violence erupted once more in June 2006, when Palestinians dug a tunnel under the barrier that surrounds Gaza and attacked some Israeli soldiers capturing one of them. They offered to exchange the soldier for the release of 95 women and 313 children, who are among some 8,500 Palestinians in Israeli prisons. Israel rejected any negotiations and, in an attempt to rescue the soldier and to stop the firing of homemade rockets into Israeli territory, invaded parts of Gaza, bombing government buildings and destroying connecting bridges and a power station that provides electricity and water. There were heavy casualties, and Gaza was even more isolated. When Hamas and Fatah leaders agreed to accept a proposal from the revered prisoners were dead or missing under rubble and a area of Sheba farms, and then Hezbollah launched a barrage of rockets on cities in northern Israel. During the first month of fighting, more than 800 Lebanese civilians were dead or missing under rubble, and 1 million, 1/4 of the total population, were displaced. 27 Israeli civilians were killed, and a large number left their homes in northern Israel or lived in bomb shelters to escape the bombardment of Hezbollah rockets. There were also an unknown number of military casualties on both sides. Although many Lebanese condemned the strength and provocative acts of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, the nation's leaders soon formed a united front in response to Israeli attacks. Lebanese Prime Minister Faoud Siniora repeatedly called for a ceasefire and assistance for his country, saying, quote, "The neighbors have failed." Despite its criticism from some Arab sources, this treaty stands as proof that diplomacy can bring lasting peace between ancient adversaries. Although disparities among them are often emphasized, the 1974 Israeli-Syria withdrawal agreement, the 1978 Camp David Accords, the Reagan Statement of 1982, the 1993 Oslo Agreement, the treaty between Israel and Jordan in 1994, the Arab Peace Proposal of 2002, the 2003 Geneva Initiative, and the International Quartet's Roadmap all contain key common elements that can be consolidated if pursued in good faith. There are two interrelated obstacles to permanent peace in the Middle East. First, some Israelis believe they have the right to confiscate and colonize Palestinian land and try to justify the sustained subjugation and persecution of increasingly hopeless and aggravated Palestinians. And second, some Palestinians react by honoring suicide bombers as martyrs to be rewarded in heaven and consider the killing of Israelis as victories. In turn, Israel responds with retribution and oppression, and militant Palestinians refuse to recognize the legitimacy of Israel and vow to destroy the nation. The cycle of distrust and violence is sustained, and efforts for peace are frustrated. Casualties have been high as the occupying forces impose ever tighter controls. From September 2000 until March 2006, 3,982 Palestinians and 1,084 Israelis were killed in the Second Intifada, and these numbers include many children, 708 Palestinians and 123 Israelis. As indicated earlier, there was an ever-rising toll of dead and wounded from the latest outbreak of violence in Gaza and Lebanon. The only rational response to this continuing tragedy is to revitalize the peace process through negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. But the United States has, in effect, abandoned this effort. It may be that one of the periodic escalations in violence will lead to strong influence. C. The sovereignty of all Middle East nations and sanctity of international borders must be honored. There is little doubt that accommodation with Palestinians can bring full Arab recognition of Israel and its right to live in peace, with an Arab commitment to restrain further violence initiated by extremist Palestinians. The overriding problem is that for more than a quarter century, the actions of some Israeli leaders have been in direct conflict with the official policies of the United States, the international community, and their own negotiated agreements. Regardless of whether Palestinians had no formalized government, one headed by Yasser Arafat or Mahmoud Abbas, or one that Abbas is president and Hamas controlling the parliament and cabinet, Israel's continued control and colonization of Palestinian land have been the primary obstacles to a comprehensive peace agreement in the Holy Land. In order to perpetuate the occupation, Israeli forces have deprived their unwilling subjects of basic human rights. No objective person could personally observe existing conditions in the West Bank and dispute these statements. Two other interrelated factors have contributed to the perpetuation of violence and regional upheaval: the condoning of illegal Israeli actions from a submissive White House and U.S. Congress during recent years, and the deference with which other international leaders permit this unofficial U.S. policy in the Middle East to prevail. There are constant and vehement political and media debates in Israel concerning its policies in the West Bank, but because of powerful political, economic, and religious forces in the United States, Israeli government decisions are rarely questioned or condemned. Voices from Jerusalem dominate in our media, and most American citizens are unaware of circumstances in the occupied territories. At the same time, political leaders and the news media in Europe are highly critical of Israeli policies, affecting public attitudes. Americans were surprised and angered by an opinion poll published by the International Herald Tribune in October 2003 of 7,500 citizens in 15 European nations, indicating that Israel was considered to be the top threat to world peace, ahead of North Korea, Iran, or Afghanistan. The United States has used its United Nations Security Council veto more than 40 times to block resolutions critical of Israel. Some of these vetoes have brought international discredit to the United States, and there is little doubt that the lack of a persistent effort to resolve the Palestinian issue is a major source of anti-American sentiment and terrorist activity throughout the Middle East and the Islamic world. A new factor in the region is that the Palestinian election of January 2006 gave Hamas members control of the parliament and a cabinet headed by the Prime Minister. Israel and the U.S. is there to be explored by the Israelis and others, and that, in any case, it is a more positive and clear commitment to international law than anything now coming from Israel. Furthermore, the remaining differences and their potential resolution are clearly defined. Both Israel and the Arab countries have endorsed the crucial and unavoidable UN Resolutions 242 and 338, under which peace agreements have already been evolved. Here are two voices, one Palestinian and the other Israeli, with remarkably similar assessments of what needs to be done. First, Jonathan Kutab, Palestinian human rights lawyer, and I quote him, "Everybody knows what it will take to achieve a permanent and lasting peace that addresses the basic interests of both sides. It's a two-state solution. It's withdrawal to 1967 borders. It's dismantlement of its settlements. It's some kind of shared status for United Jerusalem, the capital of both parties. The West Bank and Gaza would have to be demilitarized to remove any security threats to Israel. Some kind of solution would have to be reached for the refugee problem, some qualified right of return with compensation. Everyone knows the solution. The question is there political will to implement it?" Unquote. The other quote is Dr. Naomi Chazan, professor at Hebrew University and a former deputy speaker of the Israeli Knesset, or parliament, and I quote her, "I don't think any difference now remains between the majority of Israelis and Palestinians in understanding that there is to be some kind of accommodation between both people. There are two possibilities on how to do it: to acknowledge and then to implement the Palestinian right to self-determination, and to make sure that the two-state solution is a just and fair solution, allowing for the creation of a viable state alongside Israel on the 1967 boundaries, and if there are any changes, they are by agreement on a swap basis. And on the Israeli side, there is a need to maintain a democratic state with a Jewish majority, which can only be achieved through the creation of a Palestinian state alongside Israel." Unquote. An important fact to remember is that President Mahmoud Abbas retains all presidential authority that was exercised by Yasser Arafat when he negotiated the Oslo Agreement, live as equals under the law. This would directly violate international standards and the Camp David Accords, which are still the basis for peace with Egypt. At the same time, non-Jewish citizens would make up a powerful swing vote if other Israelis were divided, and would ultimately constitute an outright majority in the new Greater Israel. Israel would be further isolated and condemned by the international community, with no remaining chance to end hostilities with any appreciable part of the Arab world. Another choice is a system of apartheid, with two peoples occupying the same land but completely separated from each other, with Israelis totally dominant and suppressing violence by depriving Palestinians of their basic human rights. This is a policy now being followed. Although many citizens of Israel deride the racist connotation of prescribing permanent second-class status for the Palestinians, as one prominent Israeli stated, quote, "I am afraid that we are moving toward a government like that of South Africa, with a dual society of Jewish rulers and Arab subjects with few rights of citizenship. The West Bank is not worth it," unquote. An unacceptable modification of this choice now being proposed is the taking of substantial portions of the occupied territories, with the remaining Palestinians completely surrounded by walls, fences, and Israeli checkpoints, living as prisoners within a small portion of land still left to them. The third choice is this: withdrawal to the 1967 border as specified in UN Resolution 242 and as promised in the Camp David Accords and the Oslo Agreement and prescribed in the roadmap of the International Quartet. This is the most attractive option and the only one that can ultimately be acceptable as a basis for peace. Good faith negotiations can lead to mutually agreeable exchanges of land, perhaps permitting a significant number of Israeli settlers to remain in their present homes near Jerusalem. One version of this choice was spelled out in the Geneva Initiative. The bottom line is this: peace will come to Israel and the Middle East only when the Israeli government is willing to comply with international law, with the roadmap for peace, with official American policy, with the wishes of a majority of its own citizens, and honor its own previous commitments by accepting its legal borders. All Arab neighbors must pledge to honor Israel's right to live in peace under these conditions. The United States is squandering international prestige and goodwill and intensifying global anti-American terrorism by unofficially condoning or abetting the Israeli confiscation and colonization of Palestinian territories. It will be a tragedy for the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the world if peace is rejected and a system of oppression, apartheid, and sustained violence is permitted to prevail.
Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid was written and read by Jimmy Carter.